Hello and welcome to Political Philosophy Club. The first rule of Political Philosophy Club is we get to decide all the rules. Political philosophers get to decide what we're allowed and what we're not allowed to do. But there are different arguments about this, from anarchists who say that there should be no rules or laws or governments, to totalitarians who want to completely repress personal freedom. Most political systems are somewhere in between, but within them, politicians are arguing for one side or the other. Today, we'll be looking at libertarianism and one of its key thinkers, Robert Nozick. Libertarians are closer to the anarchist side of the debate. Some even call themselves anarcho-capitalists. They believe in maximum freedom and minimum rules. Libertarians want freedom or liberty from the demands that other people seek to make on them. So they're opposed to any collective action that's not consensual. They argue for personal rather than social responsibility, self-reliance rather than dependence on others, and they believe that risk-taking enterprise is the engine of human development. As a political philosophy, it finds its heart in the United States and the American dream, the idea that everyone can make it if they have a vision and put enough effort in. This calls back to the pioneer spirit through which early immigrants gave up their homes and endured the hardships of the journey westward, following the dream of a better life. Libertarians praise the rugged individualism of those who shunned assistance to make a life for themselves on their own terms. To imagine the archetypal libertarian society, it helps to think of a frontier town in the Wild West. In this town, we have a saloon, a barber, a blacksmith, a gunsmith, a dry goods store which sells basic foods and necessities. There's a doctor, a schoolhouse, and a sheriff. Now the sheriff is the government in this town. People might come together in the town hall to make bylaws, but the sheriff's job is to protect law and order, keep the peace, protect life, and protect people's property. But there are certain things that the sheriff won't do. The sheriff doesn't provide free healthcare, education, or welfare for those who find themselves destitute. If you want to see the doctor, you have to pay. If you want to educate your children, you have to contribute to the teacher's wages and the upkeep of the school. If you can't pay for goods, you don't get the goods. For Robert Nozick, a libertarian political philosopher who made his name in the 1970s, this comes close to the ideal society. Before turning to libertarianism, Nozick had been a Marxist, and while Marx argued from each according to ability to each according to need, Nozick complained that this ignored choice and that there was something fundamentally wrong with it. He argued for the thesis of self-ownership, we own ourselves, and claimed that on the basis of all this, all other rights followed. We own ourselves and what we produce, so nobody can use us to achieve their goals without our consent. However, this is exactly what happens when we pay tax. We don't get to choose what our taxes pay for and what they don't pay for, but a significant proportion of our wage goes towards paying for things that benefit other people. Nozick regards that as theft. To demonstrate his point, he came up with the Wilt Chamberlain argument. Wilt Chamberlain was a famous basketball player in the 1960s, but given that won't mean much to anyone who isn't an ancient basketball fan, let's make this the Beyoncé argument. Imagine we live on Sesame Street. Living on the street, we have Bert, we have Ernie, and finally we have Beyoncé. What we want to consider is what would be a fair distribution of goods on Sesame Street between Bert, Ernie and Beyoncé. If we know nothing about them other than that they all live on the street, let's say it's fair to distribute all goods equally. Now, imagine one day Bert is walking down the street and he hears Beyoncé singing to herself. Enraptured by her heavenly voice, Bert asks Beyoncé to sing for him. But Beyoncé is busy making Jay-Z a birthday card. So Bert offers Beyoncé £10. Beyoncé accepts, sings Bert Crazy in Love, and Bert pays Beyoncé the £10, happy to be walking away with an experience he'll never forget. Now this creates a new distribution of goods. Bert now has £90 Ernie, who prefers listening to grindcore, still has his 100, but Beyonce now has 110. Now this distribution is unequal, but is it fair? Well, Bert and Beyonce freely exchanged goods and services, both consented to and were content with the exchange, so it certainly seems fair. It seems unfair to disadvantage Beyonce by redistributing her additional £10 back to Bert. After all, Bert can't return her performance and wouldn't if he could. The conclusion Nozick draws from this is that inequality is fair if it is the result of free exchange. In addition to this, redistribution of goods is unfair through taxation if it isn't consented to. Nozick said, taxation of earnings from labour is on par with forced labour. Seizing the result of someone's labour is equivalent to seizing hours from him and directing him to carry on various activities. In other words, it's a form of slavery. Now, we've considered some arguments. Let's consider the criticisms. It seems natural to question whether it's correct to compare taxation to theft or slavery. The latter analogy is certainly culturally inappropriate. To compare 1 or 2 hours of your working day to the brutal murders, beatings, rape, starvation and subjugation that was meted out to hundreds of thousands of Africans by barbaric European regimes and their colonies is ignorant at best. But it is taking people's earnings without their explicit consent, so maybe it could be considered a type of theft. Now it seems some non-consensual taxation is necessary just in order to maintain a system in which it's possible to earn and own property. To protect property against common theft requires a basic system of law and order, and that must be paid for. The sheriff in our frontier town has to be paid wages, otherwise there will be no sheriff, and the stores and houses will be open to looting. There'll be those who don't consent to even this basic level of taxation, but are we right to think of the other townsfolk as having stolen from them? Libertarians accept a certain minimum level of taxation is necessary, and that's what distinguishes them from anarchists. They accept law and property. But libertarians argue that taxation and the state need to be kept to a minimum. They call that a night watchman state because its role is restricted to keeping a watch over people and their property. But if they regard taxation as theft, then even they accept some theft is necessary. We can also question the thesis of self-ownership. Is our body really our property? What we're getting into here is the question of where property rights come from. Although there are some great classical liberal arguments that say these rights are natural human rights, property is a legal concept, and so it's derived from law. If there are laws that can be found in nature that say that people are free owners of property, then for the vast majority of human history, we were ignorant of such laws and had no problem violating them. Individual property rights really come about with the establishment of capitalism through foundational constitutional documents like France's Declaration of the Rights of Man and the US Declaration of Independence. Although some libertarians may argue that there is something more fundamental to capitalism than it being just another historical mode of property relations, it would be a stretch to call it natural. After all, there is no property, free exchange of property, or violation of property rights in nature. Looking at Nozick's Wilt Chamberlain argument, inequality is regarded as fair because the original distribution of goods is regarded as fair and everyone consents to the exchange that then takes place. However, in reality, people are born into their socio-economic positions, and given the scale of global inequality, the vast majority would probably regard these positions as unfair. If Bert, Ernie and Beyonce started out from grossly different levels of income, we might be more inclined to question the fairness of any later exchanges that took place. It's the consequence of life on libertarian Sesame Street, however, that causes the greatest moral problems. Imagine that Ernie is paraplegically disabled and has no means to earn an income. When Bert and Beyonce's incomes fall, they can go out and sell their labour in return for wages. But once Ernie has spent his savings, he has no means of income beyond relying on the charity of Bert and Beyonce, and he has no right to expect this charity to be guaranteed. A model of ownership in which it's regarded as more legitimate for people to have to sell their organs or die of starvation than to regularly redistribute a small proportion of other people's income is a highly questionable model, ethically speaking. Finally, we need to think beyond the hypothetical or small-scale examples in which libertarianism appears to work. With the expansion of frontier towns into cities, population growth led to a host of social problems. Consider, for example, the increased possibility of fire that arises from densely populated urban environments. The possibility of fire in one house is a threat to the property of another. But in cities like New York, fire companies were privately owned enterprises and only put out fires for a fee. If a house was uninsured, they would let it burn and only put out the fire as it spread to insured properties. Quite apart from the fact that this system encouraged corrupt practices that threatened the property of both the insured and the insurers, it was soon recognised that private property was much more effectively protected if these fire companies put out all fires around it, whether those fires came from insured properties or not. Out of self-interest, people may complain about paying for a service that benefits other people, particularly if their own house hasn't caught fire. But providing such a service was regarded as being in their true best self-interest. And this brings us to what appears to be the nub of the problem with libertarian utopias. Like our frontier town, built on individual enterprise and self-reliance, it only works for as long as others do the same. While we might demand that others don't depend on us for their own well-being, we can't demand that they actually do well for themselves. When people aren't doing well, we find that we aren't as isolated from each other as libertarians would have us believe. Thank you for taking the time to visit Philosophy Club, and I hope it's inspired you to take a look a little more closely at the world around you. Bye for now.